Brilliant. Okay, let's get started. So, hi everyone. I'm Ollie. I've been running Politics Explained for the last 3 or 4 years now, to really try and help students as much as possible get an A star in A-level politics, or get the grade that they really want to get. And this is the first of two-hour live revision webinars we're doing on the Politics Explained YouTube channel on electoral systems. So the first one is today from 6 till 8 p.m. and the next one is exactly the same time next week. But of course, I'm sure many of you will be watching this as the recording instead. This is the first one we're doing of these weekly revision webinars. We're doing for free on YouTube, but effectively all the way up into the exam, we're running weekly revision webinars that will, by the exam, effectively cover everything you need to know for UK politics, UK government, and the US. And they're designed both for Edexcel and AQA. So we thought we'd give you the first one away for free on electoral systems, just to see if you like it. And then I'll tell you about how you can kind of come along to the others if you're looking for that really detailed structure revision all the way up until the exam. So in terms of what we're going to be covering today then, we're going to be looking first at the specification and potential questions. We're then going to look at how first past the post, AMS and STV work. We're then going to compare first past the post, AMS, the additional member system, and STV in terms of representation and proportionality, type of government created, and voter choice. They're three really key criteria you want to be using in your essays. We're then going to look at the most likely electoral systems questions, including doing some essay planning for them, and finish off with how to get an A star in this topic in particular. This is one where everyone's going to be really well prepared. So there's some key things you need to do to differentiate yourself and try and hit those top grades. Throughout, we're going to have loads of A star tips, A star writing examples, loads of time for questions, essay planning, and writing tasks. And then next Thursday, or of course, if you're watching the recording, this part 2 might already be out on the YouTube channel. We're going to have a look at starting off by having a look at the even more difficult questions on first past the post, AMS and STV. There's a slightly less likely to come up, but you need to be really well prepared, and those include cross-topic questions. We're then going to look at a practice source question, some essay planning, and some AQA 9 markers. And then we're going to finish off the webinar by looking at the other part of electoral systems, which is slightly smaller, but that's referendums. We're going to look at the content, the questions, and do some essay planning and really look at how to get an A star in referendums. And then we're going to finish off as part of the webinar, as is going to be the case with all of our weekly revision webinars all the way up to the exam. I'm going to give you a kind of a revision plan to really give you a clear pathway of how you're going to revise all the way up until the exam. And once you've done that, hopefully you'll go into that exam, that first exam on UK politics, or on UK politics and government if you're doing AQA, with real confidence. Okay, the first link in the description, you can access the supplementary notes for this webinar. These are completely free. Effectively, during this webinar, we're going to have lots of tasks, effectively, and so lots of example A-star paragraphs, and these put them all in a file, so they're just a bit easier to read. So look, go to the first link in the description for that. And I want to tell you about before we get completely started, I want to tell you about the weekly revision webinars we're running all the way up until the exams. So this week, so they're always going to be on Thursdays and Saturdays. This week, we're starting with UK Constitution and US Constitution and Federalism. So this is the only revision webinar that's going to be free on YouTube. The others are through Zoom, effectively. So there's 2 hours, 4 hours for each of these as well, two-hour long sessions. And you can sign up for those on the Politics Explained website if you're interested. You don't have to attend live. You can purchase them, but you also, whether you attend live or not, you'll get the recording to revise with all the way up until the exams, or if the webinar's already happened, you can just purchase the recording. We're then going to go all the way up until the exams and cover everything, as I mentioned. So in February, we're starting off with Conservatism, Parliament and Congress. And then we're going to do 3 sessions on each of these. So 6 hours in total for all of these. And in fact, you're going to teach you all of the content, show you exactly how to revise, go through all the key exam technique and make sure you're really, really prepared going up into the exam. And you'll be able to sign up for these on the Politics Explained website from the 1st of February if you're interested. As I mentioned, once you purchase the webinar, you can use it as a real revision tool to guide your revision. You can use that recording all the way up until the exams, whether you are able to attend live or not. And also what we're doing this year is, if you don't want to commit to the weekly webinars, I know there's 6 hours a week there's a lot of them, you can instead just wait and do our Easter revision webinars, which are the perfect alternative. They're of course not going to cover every topic in as much detail, but they still they're kind of like 5-6 hours long, 7 or 8 hours long for actually the US and global ones. for each part of the course. So that might be UK politics, UK government, or US politics and government. And these are both for Edexcel and AQA. They had loads of over 40 5-star reviews last year, so we're bringing them back. And if you don't want to kind of commit to those weekly webinars and you're still interested in kind of our original webinars, feel free to go to these instead. Of course, they're not going to go to quite the same level of detail, but they really are also designed to really give you as much value as possible within the 5 or 6 hours to help prepare you for the exam, including going through predicted topics, key examples, essay planning and A-star tips, model conclusions, and lots of time to ask questions as well. Okay, you probably all know this already, but check out our other resources on the website. We've got essay plans, revision notes, example packs, and a kind of completely free essay writing course, which has helped loads and loads of students improve their grades. And also this year, we're going to be bringing out flashcards to hopefully help you with that kind of active recall. These are going to be physical flashcards and source question packs to help you revise as well. So yeah, subscribe to the newsletter on the Politics Explained website and you'll know as soon as these get released. Another really exciting thing we're going to be releasing is for this year. Hopefully in the next month, we're going to be starting to release History Explained, Geography Explained, and Sociology Explained. And these are effectively very similar resources to Politics Explained to help you with all of these subjects. Yes, this is going to be on YouTube forever, so you'll be able to access the recording to this afterwards. As well. But yeah, go to the second link in the description if you want to be notified as soon as we launch these new subjects. So there's going to be essay plans, completely free videos, webinars for all of these as well. So hopefully, I know a lot of people who do politics also do history and sociology in particular, but also geography. So hopefully you'll find those useful. We've been working very, very hard behind the scenes to get these prepared. Okay, going into the webinar now. So let's start by having a look at the Edexcel specification for electoral systems. And effectively what it covers is the different electoral systems. So first past the post, additional member system, single transferable vote, and supplementary vote. Really looking at the advantages and disadvantages of these systems and comparing first past the post crucially to one of these more proportional systems. And normally you would have learned either or both the additional member system or single transferable vote. There's also electoral system analysis at the end, kind of looking at the debate between the different electoral systems, why they're used, the impact they have on the government and the type of government appointed, and the impact they have on party representation and on voter choice. And then the final topic is referendums, effectively. How referendums have been used since 97 and really the advantages and disadvantages of them. Should they be used more or should they not? What we're going to have a look at today is effectively that key first point. We're going to really explain the electoral systems in detail and look at the key questions you can get on them. I mean, these are the most likely questions on which electoral system is the most effective and the core question on whether first past the post should be replaced with one of these more proportional electoral systems. Look at the AQA specification. It's effectively very, very similar. The AQA always sets out in a little bit less detail, but it's kind of debates and issues around the performance of electoral systems in the UK and also referendums. So the advantages and disadvantages of first past the post, as well as another electoral system, the impact and nature of referendums in the UK. Do they have a positive or a negative impact? But also you could get some 9 marks on the specific characteristics or impact of different electoral systems in use in the UK. And we're going to have a look at those in next week's part 2, next week's webinar, effectively. Okay, a really useful thing to start off with is look at what some of the past questions are they've asked on this topic. And in the Edexcel, the recent questions they've asked, we saw actually there hasn't been a question on electoral systems in a while. In 2022, there's a question using the source, evaluate the view with specific reference to at least one devolved region using an alternative electoral system. So that's where that specification is telling you to have a look at AMS or STV, and it's asking you to see, is the case of proportional representation to replace first past the post now established? So that's that core debate whether first past the post should be replaced and scrapped. And we've seen that a similar question in 2021 as well that combines it a little bit with parties. We're going to look at that next week as well. And of course, there's also been ones on the impact of first past the post on effectively party representation, which is a slightly more complicated question as well. We're going to look at those more complicated questions at the start of next week's webinar, but today we're going to focus on the really key questions, whether first past the post should be replaced and which electoral system is the most effective that's in use in the UK. And if you know those really well, you'll be really well prepared for the exam. Also, questions on referendums effectively centered around the core argument. Do they have more benefits or do they have more drawbacks effectively? And it might phrase it in terms of its impact on democracy. It might phrase it in terms of problems versus solutions or advantages and disadvantages, but it's that core debate. Do referendums fundamentally, are they a good thing, and do they fundamentally benefit democracy in the UK and have more advantages, or do they have more disadvantages? In terms of likely kind of future questions for this year's exams, I think referendums could absolutely come up, but it's come up a couple of times recently in 2023 and 2024. That absolutely doesn't mean they can't ask it again. Of course, they asked it in 2023 and then again in 2024. So you need to know every topic, you need to revise everything really, really well. But crucially, I think electoral systems is a topic that in Edexcel especially is quite likely to come up this year. It's a very topical debate after the 2024 election in particular, as we'll look at why in this webinar. And it hasn't been asked in a few years, effectively. All electoral systems questions, but crucially whether it should be scrapped, but also the impact on proportionality and representation, party representation, and voter choice. And we're going to look at how you can prepare for these questions. What are the key questions you can get asked as we go through the webinar? AQA past questions, you actually got a question last year on electoral systems, so on the impact of first past the post on the party system, as effectively whether it creates a two-party system and does it stop political pluralism. That's one that could be... That's one interesting that could be asked in Edexcel as well going forward. You've also had questions on referendums, some 9 markers, but also the kind of classic questions on the advantage and disadvantage of referendums and whether first past the post should be replaced. This year, any electoral systems or referendums topic in AQA is as likely as any other to come up. So you need to make sure it's a big topical debate and you need to make sure you're revising everything. Okay, we're going to go through these in loads more detail throughout this webinar, but I just wanted to start off by flagging a couple of key tips on how to do well in this specific topic. You're going to be doing these in all of the webinars because actually for each specific part of the course, sometimes it's a little bit different, the key things you need to do to hit those top grades. The first A-star tip is to organise your paragraphs around criteria, voter choice, type of government created, and proportionality and representation being the key 3, rather than doing one paragraph on each electoral system. So you might be inclined to do, okay, a question on which electoral system is the most effective in use in the UK. I'll do one paragraph on first past the post, one on the additional member system, and one on single transferable vote. That's absolutely not what you should do. If you do it on criteria, you'll still be comparing those electoral systems, often first past post versus another electoral system, but you'll be able to base your judgment on these criteria because you'll be analysing them really effectively in 3 different ways, and that will really enhance not only your analysis because you're picking up way more analysis marks because you're analysing and comparing the systems in these 3 different ways, but it also helps you in terms of evaluation, as we'll speak about as we go forward. For example, you can weigh up these criteria in your judgment. First past post may be effective in creating strong governments and be simple to use for voters, but in a democracy, representation and proportionality are the most important, therefore first past post should be scrapped. And it's an example of how you can use the criteria to really justify your judgment. The second key point we're going to have a look at is using your knowledge of how an electoral system works to explain why it creates a certain outcome. This is why your knowledge needs to be really strong on how first past the post, AMS, and STV work. Because when explaining a point for an advantage or a disadvantage of one of these systems in a particular way, you want to explain what in the system creates this advantage or disadvantage. Why does it operate in this way? You don't want to just say first past post creates unproportional outcomes, which are bad because. You want to say first past post creates unproportional outcomes because it's a simple plurality system, which means that a party can win a majority of seats with just a minority of their votes, and single member constituencies mean that minor parties without geographically concentrated support can't win seats. And then really explain it. So it's bringing in that knowledge of the electoral system to really bolster your analysis and really impress the examiner. We're going to look at this in loads more detail throughout the webinar. And crucially, the final key point is don't try and cram every electoral system into every paragraph. You're just not going to have enough time and enough space. Comparing first past the post with just one other electoral system in each paragraph is enough. And in fact, you actually only need to know first past the post and one other system. You only need to know first past the post and either the single transferable vote system or the additional member system. So it's beneficial if you're pushing for that A-star to know both of them, additional member system and the single transferable vote system. but you don't need to. And you can absolutely get an A star just by comparing first past the post with one of the other systems throughout your essay effectively. Okay, we're going to start now by having a look at some really key content, and that's how each electoral system works. I know a lot of students find this really, really complicated, so I'm going to try and explain it as clearly and in as much detail as possible. But you really need to make sure you're going into this exam with real confidence and real clarity on how they work, as then you'll be able to explain the advantages and disadvantages really effectively. Okay, and we're going to start off by having a look at first past the post. The key thing to understand about first past the post is it's a simple plurality system. To win a seat, a candidate must win more votes than any other candidate in their constituency, but they don't need a majority. And that's what a plurality means. It's a majority is over 50%. A plurality effectively means more than anyone else. And it's a simple plurality system because if you win 6 votes and everyone else wins 5 votes, simply you win and you get that seat. It's not split up at all. And in fact, this is really clear. In 2024, in the election, just 96 MPs were elected with a majority of votes in their area. So this really has an impact. Most MPs don't have majority support within their constituency. We'll bring that in later on, effectively. Clearly explaining the fact it's a simple plurality system is key, as it causes first past the post main disadvantage. The fact that most MPs don't have majority support within their constituency is the fundamental cause of the fact that first past the post isn't a very proportional electoral system. So when I said at the start, you want to be bringing in this explanation of the electoral system into your analysis. For first past the post, bring in the fact it's a simple plurality system is the really key thing that you're going to want to be doing. Very simply, how does it work? Voters cast a single vote by placing a cross next to the preferred candidate in their constituency. You can see an example of here of the ballot paper. You effectively turn up. There's a number of different parties and candidates, and you just vote for one of them. So you can't vote for 2 parties or 2 candidates. It's very simple. You turn up, 1 vote, and that's who your vote goes towards. And if you don't select the MP who wins, your vote is effectively wasted, which we'll cover in more detail when we look at voter choice later in the webinar effectively. Just to give you an example of what I mean when it's a simple plurality system, in Poole in 2024 in the general election, the Labour candidate won, but they only had 31.84% of the vote. Just behind them was the Conservative candidate who won 31.8% of the vote. But those kind of extra, it must have only been, it was 18 votes effectively, those extra 18 votes meant that Labour won the whole seat. The Conservative, when I say the votes are wasted, what I mean is that if you voted for the Conservatives, they almost won, but your vote doesn't matter. It doesn't then get counted in a different way that helps the Conservatives win a different seat. If you win a plurality, if you win the most, you get all the winnings effectively. So Labour might have only beaten any other party by 18 votes and might have only got kind of less than 32% of the vote, but they got 100% of that seat. And that's really key to understand and to explain in your essays. First past the post is used in UK general elections and local council elections in England and Wales. In the UK, general elections are called at the discretion of the Prime Minister. They have to take place every 5 years, but they're often called more frequently than this when the Prime Minister wants to and when it's in their interest. There are 650 constituencies in UK general elections with an average of around kind of 73,000 votes in each. And all MPs are elected from their constituencies. So the overall vote share across the country doesn't matter. It's effectively everyone, all 650 MPs represent a constituency. And we'll look later how this compares with the additional member system in particular. Crucially, this means that parties require geographically concentrated support. If you have 10% of the vote across the country, it's irrelevant if that's not geographically concentrated. Because, for example, a party like Reform had 15% of the vote, just below it, but 15% of the vote around in the 2024 election. So but they don't get 15% of the seats, because if they're getting 15% in each constituency, they're not winning any constituencies. So they won 5 constituencies because in some they were able to get up to 30, 40%. But because they didn't have geographically concentrated support in most constituencies, they really struggled. And this is really key to understand and to explaining why first past the post harms minor parties in particular. In terms of how an election is won, if a party wins 326 constituencies, so a majority of the constituencies, they can form the government. And if no party has a majority, such as in 2010, as you can see down here, two parties have to come together that together have more than 325 constituencies. The 2024 election, we're going to look at even more detail, but Labour won 412 seats, so a really large majority. A really useful thing you can bring into your analysis in electoral systems essays is a bit about why that's the case. Understanding why first past the post is the electoral system in the UK. Understanding why it's effectively used and hasn't been replaced, why it survived, could be a useful thing you can bring into your analysis. And there's two key reasons for this. Firstly, it's because it suits the interests of the Labour and Conservative parties. They've dominated UK politics and governments since 1922. Actually, since 1922, there's never been a government without one of them, and almost all of those governments have been majority governments. Ultimately, it keeps them in power, so why would they remove it? Actually, we saw this really in practice after 1997. Blair kind of offered the idea of a referendum on first past the post in Labour's 1997 election manifesto, but scrapped the idea after first past the post allowed Labour to win a huge majority in the 1997 election. So he liked the idea of proportional representation, but once he kind of discovered that first past the post was going to help him stay in power, then of course it got scrapped. And that's a key reason why first past the post has survived. But the second key reason, so that's a bit, maybe you could say, an undemocratic reason, and you could bring that into your analysis potentially for an argument that first past the post should be replaced, actually, because it's only being kept because it benefits the two main parties. But the other main reason is that it's popular with much of the public. And that's a democratic reason why it's maintained. And that's largely because it's simple to use. And we saw that in the 2011 alternative vote referendum, which is a referendum on replacing first past the post with a more proportional electoral system, the alternative vote system. And it was rejected by 68% of those who voted. So these are the key reasons why it's in place in the UK for UK general elections, and effectively you can use these potentially as part of your analysis or as part of your evaluation in your essays. Okay, moving on now to the additional member system. So this is the system that's used in elections to the Scottish Parliament and the Greater London Assembly. Before 2024, it was also used for the Welsh Assembly. We're mainly going to be using Scotland for the examples here. It's a mixed member proportional system, and that's a really key phrase you can use and remember and bring in to your essays to impress the examiner. Crucially, it's where voters cast two votes. So as we can see on the ballot paper here, you have one vote where you vote for the constituency member in exactly the same way as you do under first past the post, but then you get an additional vote, and that's just for a party. So here you can see it's for a member, and these represent parties, but here your second vote is just for a party. You don't know which member you're voting for, effectively. So the first vote is for that constituency representative. And in Scotland, there's 129 MSPs, members of Scottish Parliament in particular, in total. And there's 73 of them have constituencies, effectively. So 73 of the MSPs are elected just like in the UK, just like first past the post, where they each represent a constituency. And from that first vote, that's how they're elected, through whoever gets that plurality within the constituency. But crucially, what the additional member system adds is that there's a second vote for an overall party. Scotland is also split into eight much bigger electoral regions, which each return 7 MSPs. And the remaining MSPs, so 56 of them, are electing using this vote. And that's that second vote for a party. And effectively, those who are elected through this vote are decided based on the vote share their party gets in the region from this second vote. So effectively, if in this second vote, the Scottish Conservatives in a particular region, if from the votes just for the parties, Scottish Conservatives got 60% in the region, they'd get 4 out of the 7 MPs from this region, effectively. So it's very much proportional and based on that vote share. But crucially, there's an additional element to it. And that's that the top-up element, kind of, firstly, it makes it more proportional because it's based on overall vote share rather than it being like first past the post. But crucially, this second vote uses the d'Hondt formula to correct the lack of proportionality in the first vote. So as we know, one of the key drawbacks of first past the post is that it's not very proportional. The aim of the additional member system is to introduce a second vote, which can then correct it. through that second vote. So if, for example, I think we've got a really good example of it here. The Scottish Conservatives in the 2021 election won 21.9% of the constituency vote. But in Scotland, they don't have geographically concentrated support. So out of the 73 seats, they only actually won 5 constituency seats, less than 7%. So they were really underrepresented based on that first past the post vote, effectively. But in the regional vote, they won 23.49% of the vote, a similar share to which they won in the constituency vote. But to correct the fact that they were underrepresented by the first past the post element, the D'Hondt formula gave them 26 regional seats, so over 45% of the regional seats. And that meant that overall, they'd won effectively 22.7% of the vote across the constituency vote and the party vote. And they won 31 seats, which is 24% of the seats. So effectively, that second vote for the party is used to correct the first vote. Whoever's underrepresented by that first vote, by the first past the post, gets more seats than their vote share from the regional vote to correct it and bring it closer to a more proportional result, and vice versa. The SNP, for example, often get loads of votes, loads of seats from the first past the post vote, from that first vote, more than their vote share, and they'll therefore not be given as many as their vote share in the second regional vote to bring it effectively to a more proportional overall seat share, effectively. Okay, and the final system, the final key system, so these are the 3 key ones. We're also going to look at a couple of others, but these are 3 key ones you're going to look to memorise, is the single transferable vote system. And this is used in elections for the Northern Irish Assembly and for Scottish councils. It's the most proportional system in use in the UK. So it has no element of first past the post. Effectively, there's no single member constituencies. And actually, instead, it uses multi-member constituencies. So in the Northern Ireland Assembly, there are 18 each with 5 members. And this is an example of the ballot paper here. Crucially, voters don't turn up and make one vote for a constituent for the candidate they want, or they don't turn up and vote 2 votes, one for the candidate and one for the party, like under the additional member system. Instead, they're allowed to completely rank their preferences. So if we look at it here, you might go, okay, Richard Bitten I'll put as 1, might go John Finch I'll put as 2, and then you effectively number all of them preferentially. What that means is that you can really show what your political preferences are really, really clearly and really fully. You might say, okay, I'm going to put the 2 Sinn Féin MPs first and the 2 DUP MPs last, but in between I want to select, okay, maybe some SDLP, maybe some alliance effectively. So it's very different in terms of how voters turn up and vote. In order to be elected, a candidate needs to achieve a quota, arrived at using the Droop formula, which divides the number of votes cast by the number of seats contested plus 1. And we're going to have a look at that in a second. And the results are calculated using a kind of complex counting process that takes into account voters' second preferences and third preferences, etc., and effectively leads to a very proportional outcome in the end. If a candidate reaches that quota on the first round, they're elected. So that will often be something like 15 or 20%. So because there's 5 MPs elected in each constituency, we divide that 100% of the vote by 5. That's 20%. If you win 20%, or it's often 15%, you clearly have enough support. So you're immediately elected. But if you don't, then you keep going and the second preferences are taken into account. You don't need to explain this fully in your essays. You just effectively need to know that voters put in together their full preferences, and all of these preferences are taken into account using the Droop formula to produce a really proportional outcome by the end. To give you an example here, in East Londonderry in the 2022 Assembly election. So what we saw is actually this one was a very close election. So no one was elected on the first votes, no one on the second votes. All of these kind of 5th and 6th preferences really needed to be taken into account. But eventually what you had is the top 5 MPs with the most votes overall using that Droop formula being elected. And crucially, what it also means is that voters can choose between members of the same party. So what you see here is one Sinn Féin candidate was elected, but another, Kathleen McGurk, wasn't elected because she got fewer votes. And that's really key. We're going to bring that into voter choice as we go forward. Really useful, again, in the same way that you can kind of bring in why first past the post is used into your analysis, you can also bring it in for AMS or STV, whichever you decide to use, or you might use both. In Northern Ireland, the single transferable vote was chosen for a very specific reason. It's because it's a highly proportional system, likely to ensure the broadest representation of different parties in Stormont. And effectively, there'd been 30 years of the troubles of conflict between two communities during the troubles in Northern Ireland, and it was therefore pivotal to avoid single party domination by Sinn Féin or by the DUP, for example, which could have really derailed the fragile peace process. And therefore, they decided to use STV to take into account everyone's political preferences and create a parliament and a government in which one party couldn't dominate effectively. In Scotland, the additional member system was chosen as a compromise that would result in a broadly representative parliament, but still maintain that local representation. You might bring that argument into an argument if you think the additional member system is the most effective electoral system in use in the UK. It combines the more proportionality with still having that kind of single member constituencies, first past the post element, which can be seen as a key benefit for local representation. Labour introduced it because they expected it would enable them to play a part in government, which they were until 2007. But of course, after then, the SNP has been successful, and then it was effectively used in Wales after it was used in Scotland. And bringing in this analysis about why certain electoral systems work well in certain situations can be a great way to add nuance to your argument and really impress the examiner. For example, you could argue that STV is the right system for Northern Ireland for these reasons, because of its specific political situation, but isn't necessary for UK general elections. And therefore, for the question, evaluate the view that first past the post should be scrapped and replaced. You could argue first past the post should be scrapped and replaced, and STV is a more effective electoral system for Northern Ireland, but it shouldn't be used for UK general elections. Instead, AMS should be used, for example. Okay, we're also going to have a look at supplementary vote because it's on the specification, but this isn't one I'd recommend learning in loads and loads of detail. Just have an idea of what it is and know the advantages and disadvantages in case it comes up in a source question. But in an essay question, I'd recommend just really using first past the post, the additional member system, and single transferable vote. It's used in elections for the London Mayor and other elected mayors, as well as police and crime commissioners. And effectively, every voter gets a first and a second preference vote. And if a candidate wins more than 50% of the first preference votes, they're selected automatically. If they're not, all candidates except the top two are eliminated. And then the second preference votes are also taken into account to produce an overall winner, whoever's got the most in terms of a combination of the first preference votes and those second preference votes. Good to know in case it comes up in a source question. We'll quickly have a look at the advantages and disadvantages. We're going to look at these for the others in much more detail, but just so you know them decently. So the winner doesn't need to get an absolute majority of the votes cast is a key disadvantage, in the same way that it is for first past the post. To have influence over the outcome, you need to kind of be able to identify the top two candidates, which isn't always clear. With the exception of London, actually, it's normally Labour and the Conservatives in London. And it means that the least unpopular candidates are more likely to win because of those second preferences are also taken into account rather than just the first preferences. But the counter is that it ensures broad support for the winner. When you add up those first and second preference votes, you have a really kind of strong mandate and strong support effectively. Sadiq Khan, for example, always had a really strong personal mandate. It's simple and straightforward to use, only 2 votes. Voters find it very clear. But it also gives greater choice than first past the post, as you can also indicate a second preference vote. The final thing we're going to have a look at then before we kind of get into some questions is the fact that Wales decided in 2024 from their next election to replace their current system, the additional member system, with a closed party list system. This isn't on the specification and you don't need to know it. It shouldn't come up in a source question. You don't need to know it. I'd actually really recommend just looking at additional member system and using Scotland as the examples, single transferable vote and using Northern Ireland as the examples, and you can just do one of those if you want, and of course first past the post as well. I just thought I'd cover this because some of you might have questions about why we don't use this. I wouldn't try and be clever and really include this loads in your essay. Just focus on AMS, focus on STV, and focus on first past the post. Effectively, what it's doing is removing the constituency element. There's just the vote for the regional list. Effectively, it's a closed party list system, and people just vote for a party rather than a candidate. And the parties effectively then decide how high people come up on their list in terms of their candidates to see who gets elected. So you only vote for a party. It makes the system simpler, but removes the local representation. You don't need to know this and shouldn't use this in your essays. It's still not on the specification. I've just included it just to clear things up and just in case it's included in a source question. Okay, we're going to have a little break now to look at some questions. So starting off, is there anything you still don't fully understand? So please put these in the chat, and if you could just confirm in the chat that you can still hear me, that would be brilliant. Second question, do you think AMS/STV would work well in UK general elections? It would be great to hear your thoughts. Put these in the chat. And this is kind of really comes in, starts you thinking about that evaluation of these questions. And thirdly, in your opinion, what is the most important criteria with which to judge electoral systems and why? And that's going to bring us in. Okay, brilliant. We're going to move on now to the really key part of this webinar, and that's analysing all three of these systems: first past the post, the additional member system, and single transferable vote, on the kind of three key criteria of voter choice, representation and proportionality, and type of government created. And this is the really key analysis you're going to be bringing to your essays and most essays on this topic. Okay, the first thing is, why do we want to judge electoral systems using criteria? So you've probably heard from your teacher that the best way to organise your paragraphs in 30 marks is around themes. So 3 different ways you're going to analyse the question. So say it's a question, evaluate the view that first past the post isn't the most effective electoral system in use in the UK. You can analyse that around 3 themes. We're going to look at it in terms of voter choice. We're going to look at it in terms of representation and proportionality. And we're going to look at it in terms of type of government created. And that's the really key way. We're going to use criteria in these electoral systems essays. This will firstly improve your AO1 and AO2 marks, as it will lead you to analyse the electoral systems in a number of different ways based on these 3 criteria, bring in a range of detailed knowledge, examples and points. But it will also help you to improve your AO3 marks, and we're going to look at these in loads of detail with a really key section near the end of this webinar on A-star tips, as you'll be able to effectively justify your judgment based on these criteria. You could say first past the post shouldn't be replaced. It is the most effective electoral system, because even though it's worse on representation and proportionality, it's more effective in terms of type of government created in particular. And I personally think that type of government created is the most important criteria. Therefore, it should be maintained, and here's why. And that can really, using those criteria to justify your argument, can be a really effective way to impress the examiner. So yeah, really explain to the examiner why you think particular criteria are important and use it to justify your argument in your overall conclusion. But I'll go through some examples of that. It's in the supplementary notes, and it's also in a task we're going to have a look at later in the webinar. So the 3 key criteria: representation and proportionality, voter choice, and type of government created. These aren't the only 3 criteria you can use to judge electoral systems, but if a question doesn't highlight something very specific it wants you to focus on, these are the 3 best, because across all 3 of them, you can come up with a really good range of points to analyse the electoral systems. In next week's webinar at the start, we're also going to look at the more difficult questions you can get on electoral systems, looking at party representation, political culture, and the party system. So if the question names one of those, for example, party representation specifically, use that as one of the criteria, or use different criteria instead. But if it's a more general question, like evaluate the view that first past the post should be replaced, or evaluate the view that first past the post isn't the most effective electoral system in use in the UK, in your answer, compare this with a different electoral system, or of course the AQA wordings that are the equivalent of those. I'd really recommend using these 3 criteria to organise your paragraphs. The first, representation and proportionality. This is arguably the most important. One purpose of an electoral system is to fulfil democracy. And that's a really key purpose, to allow people to select the parliament and the government that they want. And if an electoral system lacks proportionality, and that means that actually the share of the vote that a party gets doesn't correlate that well to the share of the seats that it gets, which obviously influences who's in government, then it isn't selecting the government that people want. And what's the point of it? What's the point of having an electoral system if it's not democratic, if it can't do that? So it's a really key criteria, and we're going to look at that. Voter choice is another really key way we can analyse electoral systems. There's major variation in voter choice between electoral systems. Can voters truly show their preferences? Can they split their ticket between 2 parties to show that they support 2 different parties? Can they choose between the members of the same party? Do their votes matter? Do they have to vote tactically? These are really key ways to analyse an electoral system, and you want voters to have a really decent choice, because if they turn up and put a thing, go and vote, but they don't really have much choice and can't really vote for the party they really want to, and can't show who they really support, does this undermine the system? This is why it's a really key criterion. And the third one is the type of government created. Ultimately, one of the key purposes of an electoral system is to elect the government. And if an electoral system consistently elects weak coalition governments which collapse and can't make any change, then can we really still argue that it's an effective electoral system? There's clearly a trade-off between proportionality and strength of government, which we'll have a look at when we look at first past the post in particular. So these are the three criteria. And if in your essays you analyse the electoral systems across these three criteria, you'll pick up loads of analysis marks and also give yourself a real effective basis to then make a really effective judgment in relation to the question. The first one we're going to have a look at then is representation / proportionality, starting off with first past the post. First past the post biggest disadvantage is its lack of proportionality. It often doesn't translate votes to seats with much accuracy at all. And this is crucially, this is what I said in the start of the webinar, how bringing in an explanation of how the system works to explain why it's got a certain disadvantage or advantage is really key. So here what we can say is, because first past the post is a simple plurality system, where only one candidate wins in each constituency and the rest of the votes don't really matter, candidates who finish second or third, even if they've only got a few less votes than the candidate that wins, aren't rewarded at all by first past the vote, first past the post. And the votes that went towards the candidates are effectively wasted. So a party could receive 20% of the vote across the country, the overall vote. If we count up everyone's votes, how much did they get? But receive no MPs, as none of their candidates may have received a plurality of votes. So in no constituency did they win the most votes effectively. They might have won 20% in every constituency, but in every constituency, another party won more than 30%. Therefore, they get no representation in Parliament, despite 20% of the population of those who voted supporting them. At the same time, a party could receive 35% of the votes across the country, so nowhere near a majority. And as long as this 35% was more than any other party in every constituency, they could theoretically win every constituency. So that's how that simple plurality system, the fact that there's only one winner in each constituency, and that winner doesn't have to get a majority of the votes, really translates to a lack of proportionality at the national level, effectively. These extreme scenarios are, of course, unlikely to happen, but they do explain two key weaknesses of first past the post. It underrepresents minor parties, which may have a significant share of the population overall, so 20% across the country, but that's not geographically concentrated, and therefore they're not winning any seats. And it also creates a winner's bonus. You could, as a party, only win 35 or 40% of the vote across the country, but because that is more than any other party, you might win 60% of the seats, for example, because you're winning more constituencies. So the first of these, the winner's bonus. First past the post exaggerates the support of the biggest party. So that's why it's called a bonus. The winner normally gets a kind of a share of the seats, far more seats than their vote share should give them. And this is because they win a lot of the marginal seats between the two main parties. So say Labour and the Conservatives are really close in an election, and Labour just win 2% more of the vote than the Conservatives. They might win 2% more, but that might lead them to winning kind of 100 more seats. Because in those seats which are really close, Labour will win them, get the seats, and the Conservatives won't. And that's really why it leads to this winner's bonus. And you can bring that in to explain that in your essays. The most recent election is the best example of this. In the 2024 election, the Labour Party won 63% of the seats with just 33.7% of the vote, despite winning just 202 seats. So very similar, with 32.1% of the vote in 2019. So they won a very similar share of the vote in both elections, but there was a massive difference in their seat share. So Labour, it was massive, 63% of the votes with 33.7% of the vote. I repeat it because it's a mental result, really, to be honest, and it's really an example of statistic you want to be bringing to your essays. And the second thing is that the representation and proportionality that first past the post is really negative at is it harms minor parties because, as I said, it favours parties whose vote is concentrated rather than spread out across a large geographical area. So for major parties, this isn't a big issue, as they have lots of voters in each constituency. They have concentrations of voters in every constituency, but it's a big problem for minor parties, where their vote is more thinly spread across the country. So their Reform had 14.3% of the vote in 2024, a really significant share of the vote. But because they were quite thinly spread across the country, they really struggled to kind of win enough votes in enough constituencies to get lots of seats. And they got just 5 seats, 0.8% of the seats. So they were massively underrepresented in Parliament in comparison to how much support they have in the country. And this contrasts with the SNP. Because they're only based in Scotland, they might win a limited share of the vote, but all of these are concentrated in Scottish seats, and they often really benefit as a result because their vote is geographically concentrated in Scottish seats. So in 2015, for example, they won 95% of the Scottish seats with just 50% of the vote. Crucially, it means this overall, because minor parties are harmed, most minor parties are harmed, the two main parties continue to benefit. The major parties benefit because they've got that concentration of votes across the country in a number of different constituencies. They have that kind of geographically concentrated support. So in 2024, Labour and the Tories won 81.8% of the seats with just 57.4% of the vote. And in next week's webinar in part 2, we're going to have a look at kind of questions you can get that combine the political parties topic with the electoral systems topic, because there's clearly a lot of crossover. Crucially, the last election, the 2024 election, was kind of measured using the Gallagher Index as the least proportional election since elections in the UK began. It's a really stark example, and this is why I think it's quite likely Edexcel will ask a question on first past the post quite soon, because it's so topical. You see this comparison here. The share of the seats compared to the share of the votes. You have Labour. Yes, they won a plurality of the votes. They won 34%, 10% more than anyone else, but they were nowhere near a majority. But they won way more than a majority of seats effectively. And Pressure Group Makes Votes Matter have compared this and modelled it to how the election would have been different under AMS and STV. And what you'll see is a much more proportional vote in AMS and STV, where Reform are actually given significant votes based on their significant seats based on their significant vote share, whereas in first past the post they're massively underrepresented, as are the Green Party, which AMS and SEV of course represent much more effectively. So what you'll see is the first past the post has the winner's bonus so clear here and harms minor parties so clear here. The AMS and STV don't have the winner's bonus, and crucially they don't harm minor parties as well. On the other hand, an element where we can say first past post is effective in terms of representation and proportionality is that it isn't very proportional due to its single member constituencies. We've seen that. That's a clear negative. It's very difficult to make the argument, or impossible, that first past post is effective in terms of proportionality. But on the flip side, this means that first past post has strong local representation. The relatively small size of most first past post constituencies and the fact that a single MP is responsible for those who live within the constituency result in effective representation of local interests and a strong link between the MP and the constituency. And what does that mean? That means that MPs, because everyone knows who their MP is, because there's only one MP per constituency and they're relatively small, around 73,000 voters, you can go to your MP. You can email them and they will try and help you. They hold weekly surgeries where you can go and meet them in person to try and lobby them on an issue that's important to you, or get them to try and help you with an issue. And effectively, MPs handle approximately 300 to 500 emails per week and put 40% of their time to constituency matters. And that can be seen as a real benefit of first past the post. Yes, overall, in terms of representation and proportionality, it's not effective, but its single member constituencies means it has effective local representation. That's a really effective counterpoint you can make when doing a paragraph on this criteria in particular. Good example of this is Corbyn. He was re-elected in 2024 in Islington North, despite being an independent candidate. So he effectively switched parties or stopped being a Labour candidate, but was still supported by his local voters. Due to the fact he's been the MP there since 1983, a lot of people in the constituency know him personally, and there's that link between the MP and the constituency. Okay, moving on now to the additional member system. And representation and proportionality is a real strength of AMS. It's the reason they've added that additional member. It's the reason they've got the top-up vote. The top-up party list element, combined with the D'Hondt formula, introduces an element of proportionality that corrects the disproportionality of first past the post and leads to a highly proportional system overall. So this is a key way you can argue that the additional member system is more effective than first past the post. And actually, it can be argued as you can make a really strong argument that it strikes a really effective balance between the need for constituency representation. It's still got that local representation. 73 of the 129 representatives in Scotland have a constituency and have that local representation. But it also used the top-up vote to correct the kind of drawbacks of first past the post. And the proportionality ensures that all of the electorate are effectively represented. So it's got that proportionality combined with the local representation. For example, in the 2021 parliamentary elections, the SNP won 84% of the first past the post constituency seats, but once the top-up members were allocated, they only had 49% of the total seats because they weren't given many of the top-up seats, leading to 47% of the vote corresponding, so they got 49% of the total seats, corresponding very closely to the 47.7% of the vote they received. A very proportional system, and that's how that top-up party list element corrects the lack of proportionality of first past the post in two ways. It reduces the winner's bonus, as shown here with the SNP, and it reduces the fact that first past the post harms minor parties by giving them more representation, leading to a very proportional system overall, using that D'Hondt formula. On the other hand, we can argue that there's actually drawbacks of AMS in terms of representation and proportionality. And that's that it can be argued that its proportionality comes at the expense of strong local representation. So unlike first past the post, not every member of the Scottish Parliament individually represents a constituency. And it can be argued that this undermines local representation and creates two classes of MSPs, and that these representatives who don't have a constituency are unlikely to listen to the voters, are unaccountable. And that's a kind of a strong argument you can make against AMS, and in a way it's less effective in terms of representation. Crucially, a key kind of problematic element of this is that because that second vote, which elects these kind of second class type of MPs, you just vote for a party. You're not voting for a candidate. And what that means is who gets elected first. Effectively what it is the party comes up with a list of the top 50 extra candidates. And if they get one candidate from that top-up vote, the top one gets elected. If they get 10, the top 10 get selected effectively. But it's the party leadership that decides out of these top-up MPs who's most likely to be elected. They rank them effectively. And it can be argued this undermines representation, as they don't have that accountability to constituents, and the party, effectively, the leadership choose how high they are on the list, which means that they're going to choose people who are loyal to them rather than MSPs who represent local interests really effectively. And that can be a way you could argue that because AMS, not all of the MPs have represent kind of local constituencies like first past the post, it's weaker in terms of representation than first past the post is. On the other hand, we could argue actually that also brings its benefits to the party list, as often parties can ensure good descriptive direct representation of disadvantaged groups through this. For example, they'll often kind of alternate lists between male and female candidates to ensure that there's effective descriptive representation of disadvantaged groups. For example, 53% of the SNP's MSPs were female after the 2021 Scottish Parliament election. Final system we're going to have a look at then in terms of representation and proportionality is single STV, the single transferable vote system. It's also one of its key benefits is representation and proportionality in particular. It's a highly proportional system with a very close correlation between votes and seats. The fact that voters are able to fully demonstrate their preferences by ranking them, combined with the multi-member constituencies and Droop formula, mean that the result reflects what voters want very, very closely, effectively. In 2007, when it was used for Scottish local elections, when it switched from first past the post to STV, the number of people with accounts that they actually voted for went from 50% to 75%. Far fewer votes are wasted because of the fact that the system can see what people actually want because they're ranking their preferences, and the Droop formula, combined with these multi-member constituencies, really is used to result in a very proportional result. Make Votes Matter estimated that if the 2024 election had taken place under STV, Labour rightly wouldn't have won a majority, and Reform would have received 71 seats to reward their 14% of the vote rather than just 5 seats, showing how it's a more proportional system than first past the post. On the other hand, again, it can be argued that this comes at the expense of local representation. As there aren't single-member constituencies at all, there are just multi-member constituencies. Voters don't have a single representative they can lobby or go to try and get their issues resolved. So that's a key argument you can make in the same way you can make against the additional member system in terms of representation. Counterpoint, though, this is quite a complicated counterpoint. You don't have to use it. It's just you're looking for the top of that A star. You could argue that the fact there are multi-member constituencies and the candidates have to compete against each other, including against candidates from their own party to win the next election and to be elected again, means that actually they're more likely to make an effort to try and represent people in that multi-member constituency. That's a small counterpoint you could use. Crucially, STV is the most proportional system, but it also comes at the expense, as we'll see when we look at type of government created, means that it almost always creates minority or coalition governments without overall majorities. And this might suit Northern Ireland, its particular political context, but it can be argued that this would be a significant drawback if it was used in UK general elections. Okay, if you go to your kind of supplementary pack, or you can kind of read it on the screen, what I want you to do is just take a few minutes, just read through this example paragraph that I've written on representation and proportionality. And I'm going to tell you now some of the key things that went into it that you can translate into your essays to do. This is a full mark paragraph example. You do not need to write this much, okay? It's very difficult to get full marks effectively in A-level politics, so you absolutely don't need to write this much. And there's an example underneath it of a A or A-style paragraph which writes a bit less effectively. I thought it's useful to show you what I mean in terms of really, really effective analysis and evaluation. So take 3 minutes to have a read through that, and then I'm going to go through some of the key reasons, like effectively point out parts of this paragraph about why it was really effective. So yeah, take 3 or 4 minutes to have a read through it. And if someone could just... Okay, brilliant. So for everyone on the recording, pause the video now and either read this paragraph on your screen, this is the first page, and this is the second page, or use that kind of supplementary set of notes that you can download in the first link in the description and have a read through it. Effectively, yeah. Pause, have a look. What we're going to have a look at now is why this paragraph was effective. What some of the key reasons and things you can translate into your own approach to this year's exams to really help you do well. The first thing is that it explains why an electoral system creates a particular outcome by bringing in an explanation of how it works, as I've spoken about a number of times throughout the webinar. We're making the point, first of all, up here, that first past post isn't the most effective electoral system, as it lacks proportionality and fails to translate votes to seats with not much accuracy. We then use the electoral system to explain why this happens. It's because it's a simple plurality system, which means that in order to win a seat, a party must have enough geographically concentrated support to win more votes than any other party in a constituency. This makes it very difficult for minor parties to win seats, as even if they have 10 to 20% of the vote across the country, this is thinly spread across constituencies, making it very difficult to win seats. So we could have gone from here straight into the example for Reform UK, but we've really explained it and analysed it using an explanation of how the electoral system works. We've done exactly the same down here when we brought in STV. STV creates highly proportional outcomes, but we've not just stated that, we're explaining why and using the electoral system to explain why, as it uses multi-member constituencies with 5 candidates and elected in each. As a result, minor parties don't require such geographically concentrated support and are able to win significant votes when they have support across the country. And that's really comparing it directly with first past the post as well. The second thing is impressing the examiner with accurate and recent statistics or examples. So we've got 2 on each side here for first past the post, for one side of the argument and for the other. You don't need to use 2 necessarily, but having these recent up-to-date statistics is really important. The exam board have recently said that having up-to-date example statistics is really, really important. So make sure you memorize some of these key statistics using flashcards. Soon we're going to have kind of flashcards out on the Politics Explained website before this is exam, so you can use those, or you can use the essay plans or make your own effectively. Just make sure you know some key recent statistics and examples. And the third thing is in one side of the argument, you cover both an advantage or disadvantage of first past post and a disadvantage or advantage of another electoral system. This is where people sometimes get confused with doing these systems. Effectively, you've got two sides of the argument. One argument that first past post is the most effective electoral system, and the other side that it isn't. And in the first side that first past the post is the most effective electoral system, we're covering an argument that first past the post is, and also that another system isn't. And then in the second half that first past the post isn't the most effective electoral system, and it's the other way. It's the other way around here. We're covering first that first past the post isn't, but also that another system is better. And if you have both of those in each side of the paragraph, that really ensures you've got that direct comparison and are backing up your points really, really effectively. And this is, of course, clear for a question like, is first past the post the most effective electoral system currently used in the UK, as it directly asks you to compare with other systems, but you could also use it for a question like evaluate the view that first past the post should be replaced, because that comparison with another system is a key way and showing another system and can bring it in and compare it to first past the post, both for the advantages and disadvantages, both for the argument they should be replaced and shouldn't. Have that comparison in both sides is a really key way to impress the examiner, hit those top marks. Okay, brilliant. If you're watching the recording, have a go at writing a mini conclusion to go at the end of that paragraph. Download the supplementary kind of notes that go with this webinar completely free and give it a go. And we're now going to have a look at an example I've got of one. So, mini conclusion tips. Using the terms of the question means you will always be answering the question. This is really, really key. Use those terms of the question. Make a clear argument and try to really justify why you believe this argument and explain why your argument is more persuasive than the other side of the argument. So use the terms of the question so the examiner is in no doubt that you're directly answering the question. Make a clear argument and really try and convince them and justify. And you could include really explaining why your argument is more persuasive than the other side. So we've got here, overall, the far more persuasive argument is that first past post isn't the most effective electoral system in use in the UK. Really clearly using the terms of the question. The central purpose of an electoral system is to fulfil democracy and allow people to choose their representatives. And first past the post patently fails to do so. It may have effective local representation. This is where we're explaining why it's more effective than the other side, but this is undermined by the fact that the system as a whole is legitimate. So we're using the terms of the question. We're trying to be really, really persuasive and justify it. And here we're justifying it in relation to democracy. And we're explaining why it's more persuasive than the other side. Yes, we've recognized that it has more effective local representation, but we're still saying why we think it's the least effective electoral system. And that's because it's undermined by the fact that the system as a whole is illegitimate. Okay, and then we've got an example here. This is also in the supplementary pack, effectively, of how the first example I gave you is a full mark example. This is still an A or an A star, but is a shorter paragraph, which shows you don't need the complete level of detail to get that kind of A star effectively. So yeah, if you're watching the recording, feel free to pause and have a read through. We're now going to compare the different systems in terms of voter choice. Firstly, looking at first past the post, and first past the post clearly has weak voter choice, as voters only get one vote. However, this also has a number of knock-on drawbacks that are useful to explain. So it's kind of obvious. Voters only get one vote. They're unable to rank their preferences like STV or demonstrate their views more fully by voting for two parties to split their ticket between two different parties like MS. And it also means they're unable to choose between different representatives or wings of the major parties. So very limited choice overall due to the fact that it's a kind of simple plurality system and you only get one vote. Crucially though, and this is really key to picking up more marks in your voter choice analysis, is saying what the consequences of this are, which is also falls into voter choice. This means that a majority of voters' votes are wasted. And if you don't vote for the winning candidate, your vote has no impact on the result or who is elected in Parliament, effectively. And this also means that votes in marginal seats, where voters are more likely to be able to influence the outcome, matter far more than in safe seats. So first of all, votes are wasted. If you don't vote for the candidate that wins, it's not like your vote then gets counted in a different way like under AMS, and you still kind of have an influence and that party you voted for is more likely to get a representative. It's just completely wasted. And it also means that if you're in a close seat where you can actually, your vote matters and you can influence the outcome, it matters much more than if you're in a safe seat. And that's a key consequence of first past the post. And that's a key way. Another way we can say that voter choice is weak is that votes are of unequal value. If you're in one part of the country, your vote matters more in comparison to another part of the country. And this decreases turnout and discourages people from voting in safe seats effectively. For example, in Liverpool Walton, there was just 53% turnout because it was clear Labour were going to win in 2024. Crucially, this is another way you can bolster your analysis and try and get up to those top marks in the voter choice paragraph, is that first past the post also leads to tactical voting by many voters who live in constituencies in which their preferred party is highly unlikely to win and therefore vote for a different party to try and at least prevent their least favourite party from winning. So if I'm in a constituency and say I support Labour, but Labour have no chance of winning, I'm not going to vote for Labour because it then might make it more likely that, let's say Reform win, and I really don't want Reform to win. Therefore, I'll vote for the Conservatives or the Lib Dems. And that's tactical voting. You know that the party you actually want to win is effectively never going to win. So you vote for someone different tactically. And that's poor for voter choice because that means that voters, in order to try and have an influence on the outcome, are realising they can't actually support or vote for the party they truly support. Tactical voting was big in the 2024 election. It's estimated that that a fifth of voters in 2024 intended to vote tactically, and it was actually a really key reason why Labour got such a big majority, as there was really strong tactical voting between Labour and the Liberal Democrats. On the other hand, we can say that in some ways, first past the post is strong in terms of voter choice. And that's because it's simple and quick, effectively, which boosts turnout. It's really easy to use for voters. They know they only have to turn up and select one candidate or party, and the result is usually known in the early morning. And this is a kind of key reason why it's been supported in the AV referendum. It's simplicity and familiarity. And it can be argued this is really good for voter choice, effectively, because it means that voters know what they're doing. They know they only have to vote once. And this encourages democratic participation. So this is a really good counterpoint. You can say that first past the post is effective in terms of voter choice. AMS then. On the one hand, it's strong in terms of voter choice because voters can split their ticket if they wish by voting for one party for a representative and another party for their top-up vote. So I could vote, for example, for the Scottish Conservatives for my constituency vote, and then vote for the SNP for the party vote. And that means if I actually like both parties, then you can vote for both. And this means that votes are much less likely to be wasted because you also get that top-up vote for the party you really want to support. In 2021, for example, the Greens won just 1.29% of the constituency votes, but 8% of the top-up vote. And this shows that many people split their ticket and voted for two parties. And they also supported the Greens along with another party. On the other hand, it can be argued that voter choice is limited due to the fact that a third of MSPs in Scotland are elected using the closed party list, as we stated. And that's that party list where it's the party leadership that ranks those MPs. The vote, that second vote for the party, you don't choose who the candidate is, you just choose the party. And this can be seen as undermining voter choice, as voters aren't able to hold the representative to account. Because for that third of MSPs, effectively, it's the party leadership that chooses who's higher up on that ranking level, who's most likely to get elected, even if a representative becomes really unpopular during one parliament. They can still be put at the top of the party list for the vote for the next parliament, and they can just be elected again rather than voters being able to hold them to account. STV, very similar. Voter choice is very high because you can choose between candidates from different parties in terms of how you can do the ranking, which is a really strong, you get a lot of choice, and you can fully demonstrate your preferences by ranking all of your candidates. On the other hand, it leads to a more complicated system, and this can be seen as bad for voter choice and discouraging voting in a way that turnout and voting in a way that first past the post doesn't. For example, it leads to donkey voting, where voters simply rank their preferences in order down the ballot. They just go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And therefore, this can be seen as really bad for voter choice because some voters truly don't understand how it works, and there's more spoiled ballots, effectively. Okay, so for the question, evaluate the view that first past the post is the most effective electoral system currently in use in the UK, or similar wording for AQA. I've written the first half of the paragraph. The most important reason why first past the post remains in use for UK general elections is its simplicity and speed, etc., etc. Look at the supplementary pack, first link in the description to have a look. A really useful task you can do is to write the second half of this paragraph. Just take 10 minutes, write the second half of this paragraph on voter choice, and also write that mini conclusion. Okay, we're actually don't think we have time for this, but so we're actually going to move on to type of government created. But before we do so, just in the live chat, any questions about that? Any questions about voter choice? Because this is the key second. Obviously, practice this in your own time as a revision, practicing this second half of the argument. This is a key kind of second criteria with which there's going to be like the second criteria in your second paragraph to compare the different electoral systems. Okay, the final thing we're going to have a look at then before we look at some kind of really key A-star tips for analysis and evaluation is the final criteria, type of government created. So, in terms of type of government created, this is, of course, the strongest criteria for first past the post. Supporters of first past the post have always argued that its biggest strength is that it creates strong governments able to carry out transformative change. Due to the fact it creates a winner's bonus and rewards major parties that have geographically concentrated support across the country, it often results in a clear big majority for one party, which becomes a strong, stable government. This gives the party a strong mandate to carry out its programme of government and bring about effective change. For example, in the 80s, it enabled Thatcher to introduce really big economic reforms because she had a big majority. The same with Blair's constitutional reforms after 1997, and these are some of the examples you can bring in effectively to support this argument. This is the clear benefit of first past the post in comparison to more proportional systems, which are far more likely to produce weak, unstable coalitions that sometimes take months to form. And if you see the role of an electoral system as to produce a government that can act in the public's interest and protect it rather than simply, or the only role is to produce a proportional result, it can be argued that first past the post is highly effective. So that's the kind of basic analysis that most people will be doing in their essays for why first past the post is strong in terms of type of government created. But you want to build on it with some of this more complex analysis. It isn't just that the government has a big enough majority to carry out change, it's also that it's accountable and legitimate. Even though governments almost never have majority vote share, as we looked at in representation and proportionality, they very rarely have any issues with legitimacy after an election or carrying out a programme of government. The losers accept the result and don't complain about the system. And this can be seen as a really effective way, first past the post in terms of type of government created. It creates a strong government, but that strong government is also very legitimate. In 2024, Starmer's Labour Party won a 174% seat majority with 33.7% of the popular vote. But there's very limited public outrage or questioning of Starmer's mandate. Crucially, another key benefit is there's always a clear alternative government waiting in opposition. This ensures the government is accountable and looking to represent the public's interests effectively between elections. That's because it promotes a two-party system. It also means that in terms of the type of government created, it's a very accountable government. And finally, it forces the public to make a decision when there's a major divide on an issue, as the two main parties often support opposite sides. So this is the fact that it creates a two-party system. Means that you have a very accountable government, and that government makes important decisions that need to be made. So bring in this kind of first key analysis that first past the post is strong because it creates a really strong government, but also build on it with one of these more kind of complex points effectively. So all students will be able to make the point that it's a strong government, but linking it into legitimacy or accountability is how you can really differentiate yourself from other students for the examiner. On the other hand, we've got some arguments that first past the post isn't effective in terms of type of government created. Firstly, it is having a government with a big majority a good thing. Single party governments can be seen as negative, especially as they don't command a majority of votes across the country. So Starmer, Labour may have a big majority, which means they can affect a lot of change. But what it means is that actually they can make huge changes without majority support across the country. And that can actually be seen as a real negative as a counterpoint in terms of type of government created. Starmer's government, for example, came in and made lots of unpopular changes that weren't in its manifesto, including in its first year. And that can be seen as a really good example of that. There is without doubt more compromise in coalition governments and a less kind of decisive policy making process, but this could actually be seen as a positive thing and a negative of first past the post, because it's actually a positive if there's compromise in coalition that results in a more compromised outcome in terms of the policy decisions that represent more of the country. And finally, we can also argue that first past post is negative in terms of this third criteria, type of government created, because it often hasn't delivered strong and stable governance. Over the past 2 decades, first past the post has failed to deliver single party majority governments a number of times, with a Conservative Lib Dem coalition in 2010 and a minority government in 2017. So we can argue actually it's not effective at producing strong governments, even if people argue that that's a strength. And yeah, first past the post doesn't always result in majority governments. We also saw that in local council elections. And you could argue actually first past the post doesn't create strong governments. The only reason you've had strong governments was not due to first past the post, but because voters' preferences were strongly in favour of either Labour or the Conservative Party over the past 50, 60 years. But now that's not the case, and minor parties like Reform are becoming a lot more successful. First past post may no longer be able to deliver strong governance. So there's some kind of more complex arguments you can use on either side to build on those kind of really key obvious arguments. The additional member system. Argument that it's weak in terms of type of government created is that it's proven more likely to lead to minority and coalition governments, which can be seen as weak and unstable. In the 6 Scottish governments since devolution, 3 have been coalition governments, whilst 2 have been minority governments. And these can also take weeks to form, or months to form, because it's not just a majority, and the party that wins a majority goes automatically into government. There has to be negotiation between the 2 parties. For example, the 2021 Butte House Agreement, which was a coalition agreement signed between the SNP and Scottish Greens, took 2 months to agree. And that could be seen as a really negative thing, as you want, after an election, a party to come in and make decisive changes. And the fact that the country had to wait 2 months can be seen as a really negative thing. There's also been instability in recent years. The Butte House Agreement collapsed in 2024 due to disagreements between the SNP and the Greens. And this is a key argument people often make in favour of first past the post and against more proportional systems, is that they're much more likely to have coalitions that are unstable, effectively. The First Minister, Hamza Yousaf, was brought down. On the other hand, we can actually argue that AMS is effective in terms of type of government created, as the coalition governments in Scotland and Wales under AMS have been largely stable. Yes, there's been minority and coalition governments, but there haven't really been... Yes, there was this destabilisation in 2024, but for the kind of 20 years before that, the coalition and minority governments were largely strong, stable, and able to implement significant changes. In Scotland, the SNP, for example, dominated since 2007 and were 1 seat short of majority in 2021. In this time, they've been a really kind of stable party that's kind of been a consistent in Scottish government. They've shifted Scotland to the left of the rest of the UK quite decisively in a range of areas, including raising income tax effectively. And this suggests that it's the preferences of voters and the party system that creates types of governments, not the electoral system. And it's a key argument that the additional member system is strong in terms of type of government created, because it's coalition governments. Yes, it creates coalition governments, but these have been strong coalition governments. It can also be argued that it's strong in terms of type of government created, as these coalitions and the governments rely on cooperation, compromise and consensus between multiple parties rather than allowing one dominant party to govern alone. And this is the counter to the argument that first past the post is effective in terms of type of government created, because we can argue actually creating one strong government that just gets to decide isn't effectively what makes an electoral system strong. Effectively, AMS is better because it encourages compromise and between coalitions that results in more representative decisions in the end. So policymaking considers a wider range of opinions and party interests. For example, the Scottish Parliament passed the Housing Act in September 2025, approved in a final vote of 89 to 28, following extensive debate and consideration of around 400 amendments. And it passed with support of the SNP, Scottish Greens, Scottish Labour and the Scottish Liberal Democrats, showing how there's a lot more kind of cooperative process in terms of making legislation. STV can also be argued to be strong in terms of type of government created, as the fact that it's kind of forced coalition governments and forced the DUP and Sinn Féin, who represent rival communities, to come together, has been key in maintaining peace in Northern Ireland. It's always created power sharing governments, and that's meant is that you haven't had a government in Northern Ireland that just represents one of the parties and could therefore kind of potentially oppress or do things that are really not supported by the other community, and that could really threaten the peace process. So that's one key argument that STV has played that has been really effective in Northern Ireland. The other obvious argument against it is STV, even more than AMS, almost always creates coalitions. It's always created coalitions in Northern Ireland. And this does lead to instability. The Northern Ireland government has been suspended for 40% of its existence. This might not be as big as a problem in Northern Ireland as the UK government just steps in during these times, but it can be seen as a real negative, a real drawback of proportional systems, of STV, in terms of type of government created, as there's real conflict and not stability to make decisions, which first past the post is arguably a lot more effective at. Okay, let's have a look at this task now. Come up with 3 key ways. So if you're watching the recording or if you're watching live, it's in this kind of supplementary booklet. Come up with 3 ways you would improve the following paragraph to try and push it up from a B to an A or an A star. And also, of course, let me know in the chat if you've got any questions about that type of government created and voter choice as well. This is the paragraph. It's also in that supplementary booklet. Take a couple of minutes to have a read through it and let me know any key ways you think it could be improved. We're probably going to run over by 10 or 15 minutes, by the way. Okay, so there's a few ways this paragraph could be improved effectively, and we're gonna effectively there's more than a few, and we're gonna have a look at those when we look at these kind of key A-star tips for analysis and evaluations. Certainly isn't a bad paragraph, but a few ways. First of all, this focuses almost all just on first past the post in terms of the level of detail. And bring in that comparison within each side of the paragraph to a more proportional system will really impress the examiner effectively. Secondly, it could explain in more detail how the system creates the outcome. So it says first past post almost always creates governments with large majorities that then have a strong mandate, but it doesn't say why first past post creates that system. It could link it in to the winner's bonus. A third point is it could use kind of more specific recent examples, including statistics, and we could have a bit more complex analysis and an evaluation that brings in that other proportional electoral system as well now. But what we're going to have a look at now is some key tips on improving, on reaching that A-star in electoral systems questions. So next week, we will start by having a look at more complex cross-topic questions that you can get on electoral systems. However, the most common questions you can get are more straightforward and cover the 2 below debates. Is first past the most effective electoral system in the UK, or is another system more effective? Obviously, it won't be phrased exactly like this, but that's the key debate. And should first past the post be replaced as the electoral system used for UK general elections? And that's replaced with one of these more proportional systems effectively. And for these questions, as we've gone through, you should do a paragraph on each of the criteria: voter choice, representation / proportionality, and type of government created. And these are really ones you can practice really effectively before the exam. Key tips to get an A-star on these questions then. So in terms of how they could be phrased in terms of Edexcel, you've got some on the screen there. Evaluate the view that first past post is the most effective electoral system for general elections in the UK. Evaluate the view that first past post is no longer the most effective electoral system for general elections in the UK. Evaluate the view that first past the post should be scrapped for UK general elections and replaced with a different system. You must refer to another electoral system currently in use in the United Kingdom in your answer. These kind of key phrasings, you want to practice 1 or 2 of these questions effectively. And then very similar questions for AQA, of course, phrased in a slightly different way, but they're effectively the same question. The key point to understand for electoral systems is that everyone will be well prepared. There are some A-level politics questions that really benefit those who work harder and revise more. And these are the more difficult questions that require more specific knowledge that students who are cramming might miss. Electoral systems is less likely to have one of these questions. Everyone knows that it can come up, and everyone will have written a practice essay on electoral systems at some point during their A-levels and will have some knowledge to answer the question. The key to reaching the top marks in most electoral systems questions, therefore, depends on the strength and complexity and knowledge of your analysis and evaluation. We're going to go through some key ways to hit A-star analysis and A-star evaluation now. The first point in terms of A-star analysis is have explicit comparison between first past the post and a more proportional electoral system within your paragraphs. This will help you pick up more A01 marks because you're just going to bring in knowledge from more electoral systems, but also a great springboard for more effective analysis that directly answers debate and does that comparison between the two systems effectively. For example, in a paragraph on voter choice, start with the argument that first past the post is weak in terms of voter choice and then compare it to how a more proportional system is stronger because that supports the same side of the argument. And then for the second side of the argument that first past the post is strong and how a more proportional system is weaker. And then, of course, a mini conclusion. So that within those side of the paragraphs, bring in that comparison between first past the post and a more proportional system to illustrate your point is a really strong way to hit those top marks. And this is the most important in questions that explicitly ask for comparison, such as evaluate the view that first past the post is the most effective electoral system in use in the UK. That's explicitly asking you to compare it with another system. But also if it's a question, evaluate the view that first past the post should be scrapped and replaced. If you're aiming for that A-star, you want to be bringing in those other systems to compare first past the post to effectively. The second point is don't just analyze the most obvious points for each criterion. I've given you some of the more complex analysis points as we went through type of government created, voter choice, and representation and proportionality. And as you use this webinar to revise, as you go up to the exams, make sure to keep having a look back at those. So for points on how first past the post is poor for voter choice, cover the fact there's only one vote, but also how it leads to wasted votes and tactical voting. And that's going to push you up to those higher marks. For a point on how it's effective in terms of type of government created, cover how it normally produces strong governments, but also how the system maintains legitimacy with voters, for example, or how its promotion of a two-party system leads to accountability of the government. It's adding these slightly more complex points as well that can be really, really effective and improve your grade up to that A-star. Third point, when writing a point on why an electoral system is strong or weak in a particular area, use the workings of the electoral system to really explain why. This is why I explained them in such detail at the start of the webinar. We went through a couple of examples of how to do so. The challenge here is to find the right level of detail, enough to really explain why and impress the examiner, but not too much where it becomes too descriptive. We've got some examples here, again in the supplementary booklet as well. We've gone through them already that really kind of give you examples of the level of detail you want and how you want to bring in the explanation of how the system works to link into your points and link into that analysis. So feel free to pause if you're watching the recording and have a look through. And then finally, it's when analysing points on an electoral system being ineffective or effective in a particular area, try and really explain why this is important. So this might be analysing how it impacts democracy or whether a government is able to properly function. So a strength of STV is that it has very high proportionality. Don't stop there. Analyse why it's important. This is important because the core purpose of an electoral system is to fulfil democracy, which is the people selecting the government that truly represents them. STV's high proportionality ensures this is the case and grants the government stability and legitimacy as a result. Or a strength of first past the post is it creates strong governments that can pass laws. And we're now going to explain why this is important. This is highly important, even if it comes at the expense of a degree of proportionality, as in order to protect the population in a democracy, a government must have the strength and ability to take decisive action and make change. So really practice that in your revision, explaining why, when you're analysing, explain why it's important. Don't just state the kind of obvious point. First past the post is weak in terms of proportionality. Explain why this is important, why this is a really bad thing. Or the same for the strengths. And you can practice that task as well. Practice that more complex analysis by supporting the following point. A strength of AMS or STV is that they give voters greater choice and ability to demonstrate their true political preferences. Yeah, feel free to do that after the webinar effectively. In terms of really effective evaluation, so there's a few key points here for getting the A star in terms of evaluation and how to differentiate yourself. Firstly, justify your evaluation in relation to the criteria and which criteria you think are the most important. That's why we've organized the paragraphs based on criteria. So you may recognize that proportional systems have a weakness in terms of strength of government, but you might argue that proportionality is the most important criteria, therefore first past the post isn't the most effective electoral system. We're justifying it by comparing the criteria. Or you can say on the other side, you may argue that first past the post shouldn't be scrapped as it produces strong governments which can enact change. And even though it's not perfect in terms of proportionality, the kind of type of government created is the most important criteria. And it should therefore be kept rather than taking a risk which would undermine the government's ability to act decisively. So really use that criteria in your judgments, in your mini conclusions, but especially in your overall conclusion and your introduction. Compare the criteria and use them to justify your argument. As with analysis, try to use it to justify your evaluation with why it's really important. Link it to impacts such as democracy or the ability of government to protect its citizens. Keep in mind, you might not be able to use all of these points in your mini conclusions or conclusions, and you don't have to. These are just a number of ways you can really try and reach that A star. You could also consider recent events and change over time to justify your evaluation. Has politics changed in recent years in such a way that first past the post is no longer effective? So, for example, you can make an argument, first past the post used to be the most effective electoral system, as it gave voters a clear choice between the two main parties, which were broad churches and which normally got at least 75% of the vote. Since the 2024 election, though, where the two main parties won just 57% of the vote, first past the post is no longer the most effective electoral system. It is designed for a two-party system and continues to promote it, despite the fact that over a third of voters now prefer other parties. We're going to look at this kind of content at the start of the next webinar. In the multi-party system that is now the case in UK politics, a more proportional system such as AMS would be far more effective, as it would truly reflect the change voting preferences of the British electorate. So that's that nuanced A-star conclusion. You don't have to use all of these kind of points for the evaluation on the analysis. This is a way you can really impress the examiner, talking about relating it to recent events as a reason for your judgment. And finally, if it's relevant, you could also consider how a different electoral system would work in practice in this new context. So if it's a question on whether first past the post should be scrapped and replaced for UK general elections, you might argue that STV is the more proportional system in use in the UK, but argue that first past the post shouldn't be replaced with STV because it wouldn't work in UK general elections, even though it does work in Northern Ireland. Or actually, you might use this as an argument for why AMS should replace first past the post. It's because it would maintain some of the key benefits and still be simple to use for voters, but add that proportionality. So really analyze and evaluate using those practicalities. So those are kind of 4 key points for analysis and 4 key points for an evaluation in terms of, we've got one more, sorry, I forgot. Explain what you think the change should happen. So if your judgment that is first past the post should be scrapped, make sure you're saying what you think it should be replaced with effectively. So as I said, you don't have to use all of those effectively, but really practice improving your evaluation, improving your analysis with some of them, and that will really help you push up your grade in electoral systems in particular. Okay, what I'm going to show you now is an example conclusion, which I want you to have a read through just to finish off the webinar. So have a quick read through. This kind of is an example conclusion that combines a lot of these key points in terms of the evaluation. And then if you want to I'll wait 10 minutes. You can write a practice conclusion for this question, and I'll give you some feedback if you want to drop that in the chat effectively. But just to finish off, before we do that, I just want to let you know that next Thursday, we're running the next revision webinar, which is going to finish off electoral systems. It's going to look at referendums and look at the more difficult questions on first past the post, AMS and STV, and also give you a revision plan up until the exams. Of course, if you're watching the recording, these might both be available already on the Pods Explained YouTube channel. The supplementary notes are in the first link in the description, so get those. They've got lots of those examples. And if you found this webinar useful, sign up for all of the webinars we're running up until the exam. We're going to be using 6 hours a week to cover everything up until the exams, and you get the recordings to revise with as many times as you want, all the way up until the exam. So this Saturday, we're starting with UK Constitution and US Constitution and Federalism. Sign up for those if you're interested. And then after that, in February, we're looking at conservatism, Parliament, and Congress. And of course, you'll be able to sign up for these on the Politics Explained website from the 1st of February. Once you purchase a webinar, you'll be able to access the recording all the way up until the exams to be able to revise with as well, whether you can attend the live session or not. And then after this, all the way up until the exams, we're going to make sure we cover every single topic. So if you want this kind of detailed, structured revision that's going to make sure you cover everything and are really prepared to hit those top grades, go to the Politics Explained website and sign up. We're also doing Easter revision webinars, though, of course.